Close your eyes if you like, settle in, and let me take you back, not to a horror story someone invented, but to something the United States government actually did. Something they tried to erase. Something that, if the theories are correct, they never truly stopped. This is MK Ultra, the program that never ended. Act 1. The Real Program, 1953. The Approval. To understand what MK Ultra became, you first have to understand what it was born from. And it was born from fear. In the early years of the Cold War, fear was not an abstract concept in Washington, D.C. It was currency. It dictated policy, funded black budgets, and justified the kinds of decisions that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The Soviet Union had demonstrated its willingness to pursue psychological warfare. American prisoners returning from Korea were exhibiting disturbing behaviours. Behaviours that intelligence officials believed were the result of communist mind control techniques. Whether that was true or not almost did not matter. The perception was enough. And so on April 13th, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles signed off on a program unlike anything that had ever existed inside the American intelligence apparatus. He called it Project MK Ultra. The name was deliberately obscure, a designation meant to pass unnoticed through filing systems, to blend into the administrative background noise of a sprawling agency that dealt in secrets for a living. The stated goals were threefold. First, develop reliable methods of mind control, techniques that could make an enemy agent reveal classified information, or that could render an American operative resistant to enemy interrogation. Second, explore and refine advanced interrogation techniques that went beyond conventional methods. Third, study and, if possible, counter the psychological warfare strategies that the Soviet Union and China were believed to be deploying against American interests. The program was placed under the direct authority of Sidney Gottlieb, a man who remains one of the most fascinating and deeply disturbing figures in the entire history of American intelligence. Gottlieb was a chemist by training and a true believer by temperament. He had a clubfoot and a stammer, two things that had marked him as different throughout his life. He was also, by all accounts, extraordinarily intelligent, deeply patriotic, and entirely willing to do things that other men would refuse. He grew organic vegetables on his farm in Virginia. He practiced folk dancing, and in the name of national security, he presided over a program that subjected hundreds of unwitting human beings to psychological horrors they would carry for the rest of their lives. That tension, the ordinary man doing extraordinary evil in the name of an idea, is something we will return to again and again tonight, because it is at the heart of what MK Ultra was and what it may have become. 1950s through 1960s, the experiments, the scale of MK Ultra is something that is genuinely difficult to absorb. This was not a small, contained research project. At its peak, it encompassed over 150 distinct sub-projects, spread across research institutions, universities, hospitals, and prisons across the United States and Canada. The program had a budget, it had administrators, it had institutional support, and it had a seemingly endless appetite for human subjects. The most well-known element of MK Ultra is its use of lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. But the use of LSD in MK Ultra was only one thread in a much larger and more disturbing tapestry. Subjects were administered a staggering range of psychoactive substances: mescaline, heroin, barbiturates, amphetamines, scopolamine, and various experimental compounds that had no approved human use. In many cases, these substances were administered without the subject's knowledge or consent. Researchers would spike drinks at social gatherings. Patients in mental hospitals were given doses without being told. And prisoners were offered reduced sentences in exchange for participation, and then subjected to far more intensive protocols than they had been told to expect. One of the most infamous cases involved Frank Olson, a scientist working for the US Army who was dosed with LSD by Sidney Gottlieb without his knowledge during a work retreat in 1952. Within days, Olson began exhibiting signs of a serious psychological breakdown. He fell, or was pushed, from a 10th floor window at the Statler Hotel in New York City on November 28, 1953. His death was ruled a suicide, though his family has never accepted that conclusion, and a later autopsy raised significant questions that have never been fully resolved. The Olson case remains one of the most troubling footnotes in the entire MKUltra story. A scientist destroyed, quite possibly, by the very program he was serving. Beyond substance experimentation, MKUltra pursued a range of other techniques with equal intensity. Sensory deprivation experiments isolated subjects in environments stripped of all external stimulation, no light, no sound, no sense of time, for periods that sometimes extended to days. The psychological effects were profound and in some cases permanent. Subjects emerged from these chambers disoriented, suggestible, and in some cases fundamentally altered in ways that did not fully reverse. Hypnosis was studied extensively, not the stage performance version of hypnosis that most people are familiar with, but deep trance states induced through chemical assistance, combined with behavioural conditioning techniques borrowed in part from the work of Soviet researchers. The goal was to create what some researchers called a programmable subject, a person who could be given instructions under a controlled state and who would carry out those instructions without full conscious awareness or recall. Electroconvulsive therapy was used at several sites, often in conjunction with drug administration, in attempts to induce what researchers described as depatterning, essentially wiping the behavioural slate clean so that new patterns could be installed. The most notorious practitioner of this technique was Dr. Ewan Cameron, a Scottish-born psychiatrist working at McGill University in Montreal under the funding of the CIA through a series of front organisations. Cameron called his approach psychic driving. His patients, who came to him seeking treatment for depression and anxiety, were subjected to drug-induced sleep lasting months at a time, combined with looping tape recordings played thousands of times and intensive electroconvulsive treatments, far beyond any accepted therapeutic standard. Many of them never recovered. Several were left with no memory of entire periods of their adult lives. All of this was happening not in some distant totalitarian state, but in the universities and hospitals of North America, under the watch of agencies that were supposed to protect the people they were experimenting on. And almost none of it was reported. Almost none of it was challenged, because almost none of it was known. 1964. Sub-project expansion. By the mid-1960s, MKUltra had begun evolving into something more sophisticated and more diffuse. It had spawned related programs, MK Search, which continued research into chemical mind control agents, and MK Naomi, which focused specifically on the development of biological and chemical weapons capable of incapacitating or killing targets without conventional means. The research focus was shifting as well. The early emphasis on brute force chemical manipulation, just give someone enough LSD and see what happens, was giving way to something more refined. Researchers were increasingly interested in long-term behavioural modification, not the dramatic, immediate effects of a powerful psychedelic, but the slow, subtle reshaping of a person's thought patterns, emotional responses and decision-making processes over time. Memory manipulation became a significant area of focus. If you could erase what a person knew or alter what they believed they had experienced, the applications were almost unlimited. An enemy agent who genuinely believed he had never visited a particular facility presented a fundamentally different interrogation challenge than one who was simply refusing to talk. And here, buried in the bureaucratic archives of mid-century American intelligence, is the first seed of what would eventually become the most troubling strand of the MKUltra conspiracy theory. Because the techniques being developed in the 1960s, behavioural modification, memory manipulation, psychological influence at scale, did not become less relevant as the years went on. They became more relevant. They became, in fact, the foundational vocabulary of an entirely new field of science. Act 2, The Exposure. 1973, The Order. In January of 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms made a decision that, depending on how you interpret it, was either the responsible act of a man trying to protect his agency from political fallout, or one of the most significant acts of institutional concealment in American history. He ordered the destruction of MKUltra records. The timing was not incidental. The Watergate scandal was unfolding in real time, and Helms was well aware that congressional investigations were becoming more aggressive, more intrusive, and more likely to uncover things that the CIA had spent decades keeping out of public view. He was also preparing to leave his position as director. Before he went, he apparently decided to close a door. Thousands upon thousands of documents were shredded. Files that documented the full scope of MKUltra's activities, the experimental protocols, the subject lists, the results, the funding chains, the institutional relationship, were destroyed, not misfiled, not archived in a restricted facility, destroyed. But not all of them. Through what appears to have been a bureaucratic oversight, a collection of approximately 20,000 documents survived. They had been stored in a financial records building separate from the main CIA archives, and they escaped the purge simply because whoever ordered the destruction did not know they were there. It was those documents, discovered in a FOIA search in 1977, that eventually cracked the story open. But consider what their survival means. If these documents survived by accident, then their destruction was not accidental. Someone made a deliberate choice to eliminate the record of what MKUltra had done. And when someone destroys a record, they are making a statement, not just about what they want to hide, but about how much they fear the truth being known. 1975. The Church Committee. The mid-1970s were a reckoning of sorts for American intelligence. The combination of Watergate, the Vietnam War, and a growing public skepticism about government institutions had created a political environment in which oversight, real oversight, not the performative kind, suddenly became possible. Senator Frank Church of Idaho seized that moment. The Church Committee, formerly known as the Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, began its work in 1975. It was the most comprehensive investigation of the American intelligence community that had ever been undertaken, and what it found was deeply disturbing. MKUltra was publicly revealed in full for the first time. The committee's investigators laid out in stark and precise language what the program had involved: non-consensual experimentation on American citizens, systematic psychological manipulation, secret funding through front organizations, and a complete absence of meaningful oversight. The program had operated in the shadows not because it had to, but because the people running it knew that what they were doing would not survive the light. The public reaction was genuinely shocked. This was not the behavior of a distant enemy. This was the United States government. These were American hospitals, American universities, American researchers, and the people they had experimented on were American citizens who had gone to those hospitals and universities seeking help, and had instead been turned into unwitting research subjects in a covert intelligence program. The hearings produced testimony that remains extraordinary to read even now, witnesses describing experiments that seem to belong to a different era, a different kind of country. And yet, there they were, documented in the pages of government reports, signed by real people with real names and real institutional affiliations. 1977, Senate hearings and the official conclusion. 2 years later, a second round of Senate hearings brought additional documents to light, the surviving financial records that had escaped the 1973 purge. Former CIA Director Stansfield Turner testified before the committee, and the hearings produced a clearer picture of MKUltra's scope than anything previously available. But they also confirmed something that researchers had already begun to suspect. The picture was permanently incomplete. The destroyed documents could not be reconstructed. The full scope of the program, the complete list of sub-projects, the final outcomes of long-term experiments, all of it was gone. What remained was a fragment a corner of a much larger canvas. The official conclusion of the investigations was that MKUltra had ended. The program had been discontinued following the 1973 destruction order, and there was no evidence of its continuation in any form. The Senate was satisfied. The public largely moved on. Life went on, but not everyone was satisfied, and the questions that remained unanswered, quiet, persistent, stubborn, would grow louder over the decades that followed. Act 3. The gap, the missing records. Here is the fundamental problem with the official conclusion, and it is not a subtle one. It is not the kind of problem you can explain away with bureaucratic inefficiency or the chaos of institutional record keeping. It is a structural problem, a logical problem, one that sits at the centre of the entire MKUltra story, like a hole in a wall that you can see daylight through. The investigation concluded that MKUltra ended, based primarily on the absence of evidence of its continuation, but the absence of evidence was itself manufactured. The records were destroyed, deliberately, before the investigation began, so what the Senate was really concluding when it declared the program over was that no evidence of continuation existed in the records that survived. And the records that survived were the ones that had been overlooked, not the ones that had been preserved. Of the documents that should have existed, approximately 20,000 survived. Researchers who have spent careers studying the program estimate that this represents a fraction, perhaps 5 to 10%, of the total documentation that was generated. What filled the other 90 to 95% of those files? What experiments were recorded there? What subjects, what outcomes, what follow-up studies, what long-term monitoring protocols? We do not know. We cannot know, not because the information was never recorded, but because someone decided we were not supposed to know it. That deliberate erasure creates what historians sometimes call an evidentary vacuum, a space in the record where something existed but nothing can now be proven. And into an evidentary vacuum, two things inevitably flow: legitimate uncertainty and theory. The challenge is determining where the boundary between them lies. The Cold War context. To understand why the continuation theory is at least plausible, if not proven, you have to understand the strategic logic of the Cold War. Because the Cold War was not merely a military standoff, it was a psychological one, and both superpowers understood, at the deepest level of their strategic thinking, that the conflict they were engaged in would be decided as much by perception, belief, and morale as by missiles and conventional military capability. The fear that drove the creation of MKUltra in the first place, the fear of a Soviet psychological warfare advantage, did not disappear in 1973. If anything, it intensified through the 1970s and into the 1980s as the Cold War entered new and more complex phases. The Soviet Union had its own programs. The KGB's Department 8 was known to be pursuing techniques not entirely unlike those that MKUltra had explored. American intelligence agencies were aware of this. They were watching. Some historians who have studied the period argue that ending MKUltra entirely, in a context where the Soviet threat remained real and active, would have represented a unilateral disarmament in a psychological arms race that the other side had not agreed to step back from. The logic, while morally disturbing, is strategically coherent. If your enemy is developing techniques to manipulate the psychology of your citizens and your operatives, you cannot afford to have no corresponding capability. This does not prove that MKUltra continued, but it establishes that there would have been strong institutional incentives for something to continue. And institutional incentives in the world of intelligence have a way of finding expression, regardless of what official policy documents say. Act 4. The Conspiracy Theory, the Continuation Hypothesis. The central claim of the MKUltra continuation theory is not that the program continued in exactly the form it had taken in the 1950s and 60s. The university experiments, the LSD dosing, the sensory deprivation chambers. The claim is more sophisticated than that. The claim is that the program evolved, that what began as crude, large-scale experimentation was refined by the 1970s into something more targeted, more technically sophisticated, and more effectively hidden. That rather than being terminated, it was restructured, dismantled institutionally, but preserved operationally, absorbed into other classified research programs that could continue the work without carrying the toxic name. The theory proposes that several things happen simultaneously. The most visible and most controversial elements, the large-scale dosing of unwitting subjects, the residential experiments, were discontinued because they were precisely the kinds of things that, if discovered, would create the most severe political damage. But the knowledge that had been gathered, the techniques that had been refined, the institutional relationships that had been built, these, the theory argues, did not simply cease to exist. Instead, the research shifted towards smaller, more controlled studies, toward research that could be conducted under legitimate academic or medical cover, with subjects who had at least nominally consented, even if the true purpose of the research was never disclosed to them, toward techniques that were more subtle, more deniable and more difficult to identify as what they were. The funding changed hands, the names on the letterheads changed, but the underlying questions: how do you influence a person's beliefs without their knowing it? How do you modify behaviour at scale? How do you create reliable psychological vulnerability in a target? These questions, the theory holds, were never abandoned. They were simply asked more quietly. The technological shift, perhaps the most compelling strand of the continuation theory, and the one that is hardest to dismiss, involves the trajectory of technology. Because the techniques that MKUltra was exploring in its later years, the behavioural modification and psychological influence research of the mid-1960s did not become obsolete. They became the foundation of an entire scientific revolution. Cognitive psychology, behavioural economics, social influence research, persuasion science, neuromarketing. These are all legitimate academic fields with extensive peer-reviewed literature, real applications, and no connection to anything covert. But they are also, in a very real sense, the refined, institutionalized descendants of questions that MKUltra was asking in the 1960s. How do people make decisions? What makes a person receptive to a particular message? What psychological conditions produce compliance? What environmental factors shape behaviour in predictable ways? The theory does not claim that all of these fields are secretly CIA programs. That would be both absurd and provably false. But it does note that the knowledge being generated by these fields is extraordinarily powerful, and that intelligence agencies with an interest in psychological influence would have an obvious reason to follow that knowledge very closely. By the 1990s and into the 2000s, the technological landscape had shifted so dramatically that direct physical experimentation, the kind MKUltra relied on, was no longer the most efficient or the most scalable approach to psychological influence. Information technology offered something far more powerful: the ability to reach millions of people simultaneously, to tailor messages to individual psychological profiles, to create information environments that shaped perception and belief without ever requiring the creation of a classified laboratory or the enrolment of an unwitting human subject in a formal experimental protocol. This shift, from direct to indirect, from individual to population scale, from chemical to informational, is at the core of how the more sophisticated versions of the continuation theory understand what the program allegedly became. Not a room full of scientists administering drugs to prisoners, but a room full of analysts studying the patterns in the data that billions of people generate every day. The modern parallel. It is important to be precise here, because the jump from documented Cold War mind control experiments to modern digital influence is a significant one, and it deserves to be treated with care rather than collapsed into a simple narrative of sinister continuity. There is documented evidence that governments, including the United States government, have conducted social media influence operations. There is documented evidence that intelligence agencies have studied the psychological mechanics of persuasion and information manipulation. There is documented evidence that data harvested from digital platforms has been used to construct detailed psychological profiles of individuals, which have then been used to target them with tailored messaging designed to influence their attitudes and behaviour. None of this evidence directly links to MKUltra. The gap between what was documented in the 1970s Senate hearings and what is documented in, say, the revelations around Cambridge Analytica or the PRISM program or any number of other digital-era surveillance and influence operations is a real one. It cannot be bridged purely by pointing out thematic parallels, but the parallels are there and they are striking. The questions are the same. The institutional actors share significant overlap. The ethical issues, the use of psychological influence on populations without their knowledge or consent, are recognisable as developments of the same fundamental problem that MKUltra raised in the 1950s. And the secrecy, the deliberate concealment, the classified programs, the redacted documents, continues in forms that look very familiar to anyone who has studied what came before. Whether that means MKUltra itself never ended, or simply that the impulse that created MKUltra never ended, is a question that the available evidence cannot definitively answer. But it is a question worth sitting with, because the answer matters for how we understand the relationship between our governments and ourselves. Act 5. The investigator, the archivist, present day. Imagine for a moment that you're a researcher, not an intelligence officer, not a conspiracy theorist with a website and a YouTube channel, just a quiet, methodical person who spends their days in archives and reading rooms, piecing together the administrative history of the mid-20th century American government. You're doing the kind of work that most people find tedious and unremarkable. You're reading financial records, and then, in a collection that has been sitting in a filing system for decades, largely untouched because it does not appear to contain anything of obvious interest, you find something, not a dramatic document, not a confession or a blueprint, something much more mundane, and for that reason much more disturbing. You find funding transfers, line items in budget documents dated after January 1973, after the order to destroy MKUltra records. Transfers routed through administrative categories that do not correspond to any program whose existence is publicly acknowledged. Amounts that are not enormous by government standards, not the kind of expenditures that would attract immediate attention from a budget oversight committee, but consistent, recurring, and continuing for years beyond the date when the program was supposed to have ended. The names attached to these transfers are not MKUltra. They are not MK Search or MK Naomi or any of the other sub-program designations that survived in the 20,000 documents. They are different names attached to different administrative units. But the researchers who appear in the surviving MKUltra documents also appear in the correspondence files associated with these transfers. Not all of them, not in ways that prove anything directly, but enough to make the overlap visible. What do you do with that? You cannot prove that the funding was for a continuation of MKUltra. The documents do not say that. They are financial records, not experimental protocols. They tell you that money moved, not what the money was for. They tell you that people with connections to a terminated program were still being paid, not what they were being paid to do. But you know, because you have spent years in these archives, because you understand how programs like this are structured and how they are hidden, that funding does not persist after a program ends unless something is still happening. Bureaucracies do not pay for nothing. Even secret programs have accounting, and accounting leaves traces even when everything else is destroyed. You write a paper. You present your findings carefully, with appropriate academic hedging. You describe what you found without claiming more than the evidence supports. And you wait to see what happens next. Nothing happens. The paper is published in a journal that specialists read. A few researchers contact you with similar observations from their own archival work. A journalist writes a brief piece that generates a week of attention and then disappears, and the funding records sit in their files, neither confirmed nor denied, neither explained nor retracted, simply there, waiting. The pattern. The investigator's story is fictional, constructed for this narrative, but the pattern it describes is not fictional. It is drawn from the actual work of actual researchers who have spent years trying to understand what became of MKUltra and the knowledge it generated. What they have found, consistently, is not a smoking gun. What they have found is a pattern. And patterns, in the absence of direct evidence, are both the most compelling and the most frustrating form of historical argument, because they suggest something without proving it, and their significance depends entirely on interpretation. The pattern looks like this: classified research programs with goals that significantly overlap with MKUltra's, behavioural modification, psychological influence, interrogation enhancement, memory manipulation, appear in the historical record throughout the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s. Some of them have been declassified and are publicly known. Others appear in redacted documents where the operational details have been removed, but the existence of the program cannot be entirely concealed. Others are referenced obliquely in correspondence between officials who knew that what they were discussing could not be committed to paper in explicit terms. None of this proves that MKUltra continued, but it establishes, clearly and without serious contestation, that the questions MKUltra was asking continued to be asked, that the institutional appetite for psychological influence research did not disappear, that the knowledge generated by the program did not simply evaporate when the documents were shredded. Knowledge, unlike paper, cannot be destroyed. Act 6. The final theory, the silent evolution. The most sophisticated version of the MKUltra continuation theory does not argue for a simple linear extension of the original program. It argues for something more complex and in many ways more troubling, an evolution. The theory holds that what began as direct physical experimentation on individual human subjects gradually transformed, over the course of decades, into something that operates at an entirely different scale and through entirely different mechanisms, that the transition from the 1950s and 60s to the present was not a break but a development, a maturation of the same underlying project, adapted to the tools and contexts available at each stage of its evolution. In the early years, the tools available were chemical and psychological: drugs, isolation, conditioning. These tools required direct access to subjects, which made the program both powerful and constrained. You could only experiment on people you had physical access to. The scale was inherently limited by logistics. As behavioural and cognitive science developed through the 1970s and 1980s, the tools became more refined. You could study how people made decisions. What factors influenced their beliefs? What psychological states made them receptive to particular kinds of information? And you could study these things through legitimate academic research, through controlled experiments with consenting subjects, without the legal and ethical catastrophe of direct covert experimentation. The knowledge accumulated, the techniques became more precise, and then, in the 1990s and beyond, the digital revolution changed everything. Suddenly, the question of scale dissolved entirely. You no longer needed physical access to a subject to study them. You no longer needed a laboratory or a controlled environment. The data that people generated simply by living their digital lives, what they searched for, what they read, who they talked to, what they bought, what they believed, was available in quantities that would have seemed fantastical to Sidney Gottlieb in 1953. The theory suggests that an intelligence community that had spent 40 years developing sophisticated psychological influence techniques was not simply going to ignore those capabilities when they became suddenly and dramatically more powerful. That the transition from MKUltra's methods to the digital age was not an abandonment of the underlying project, but a scaling up of it, a move from individual manipulation to population-level influence, made possible by technologies that did not exist when the program began. Less visible, more scalable, more deniable. And in those qualities, the theory argues, lies the reason it has never been exposed in the way that the original MKUltra was exposed, because there is no single program to expose, no single laboratory to raid, no single set of documents to declassify. There is only a continuous practice, distributed across institutions and technologies and decades, that has become so deeply embedded in how power operates that it would be almost impossible to point at it and say, there, that is where it begins and ends. Why it would stay hidden. If such a program existed today, if the impulse that created MK Ultra had truly never ended, only changed its form, why would it remain hidden? The answer to that question is perhaps the simplest part of this entire story. Because the alternative is unacceptable, not just politically, not just legally, but fundamentally at the level of what it would mean for the relationship between a government and the people it governs. A government that systematically attempts to influence the psychological states of its own population, its beliefs, its perceptions, its decision-making, without that population's knowledge or consent is not, in any meaningful sense, a democratic government. It is something else. Something that has retained the forms and the language of democratic governance while abandoning the substance of it. And that is a truth so corrosive, so fundamentally threatening to the legitimacy of the institutions involved, that the institutions themselves would have the strongest possible motivation to ensure it was never clearly stated. The other reason it would stay hidden is simpler and more human. The people who would be responsible for revealing it are people who exist within the systems that would be implicated by the revelation. Whistleblowers require not just courage, but a belief that the revelation will matter, that someone will listen, that there will be consequences, that the sacrifice will be worth it. And in a world where the public has already processed the original MK Ultra and largely moved on, where the church committee hearings are historical curiosities rather than living wounds, there is less reason than ever to believe that another exposure would produce lasting change. So it stays hidden, not through a single act of deliberate concealment, but through 1,000 small acts of institutional self-protection, bureaucratic inertia, and the simple human preference for not knowing what is inconvenient to know. Epilogue. The program that disappeared officially, MK Ultra, ended decades ago. The records were destroyed, the investigations concluded, the officials testified, the senators nodded, and the curtain was drawn. Case closed. Program terminated. Nothing more to see here. And yet, the questions persist, not because conspiracy theorists refuse to accept the official record, but because the official record is incomplete by design. Because a record that was deliberately destroyed cannot be used to establish that nothing lay beyond its edges. Because the institutional logic that created MK Ultra, the belief that psychological influence is a strategic asset, that the manipulation of human perception is a tool of power, that the boundary between foreign and domestic operations is a formality to be respected only when convenient, that logic did not end with the program. We live right now in an era in which the psychological manipulation of populations at scale is not only possible but routine. Advertising has always done something like this, of course. But the sophistication, the granularity, the individualization of modern influence operations, commercial and political and potentially governmental, represent something qualitatively different from what came before. The ability to know, with considerable precision, what a specific person is afraid of, what they desire, what they believe, what makes them angry or hopeful or compliant, and to use that knowledge to nudge their perceptions in a chosen direction. This is not science fiction. It is the present. The question MK Ultra forces us to ask is not whether this kind of influence is happening. It is who is doing it, under what authority, and with what oversight. And the honest answer to that question, the answer that emerges when you look at the available evidence with clear eyes and no predetermined conclusion, is that we do not fully know. What was learned in those classified laboratories before the files were shredded, what continued under different names and different funding lines in the decades after the official termination. What knowledge, carefully gathered and never published, informed the development of the digital influence infrastructure that shapes so much of our information environment today? We cannot answer these questions definitively. The evidence that would allow us to answer them was, by design, destroyed. And so we are left where the best historical mysteries always leave us, in the space between what can be proven and what cannot be ruled out, in the gap between the official story and the full truth. MK Ultra, the official record tells us, ended, but the official record was written by the people who destroyed the documents that would have told us what really happened. And that is perhaps the most important thing to remember as you close your eyes tonight, as the world outside grows quiet and your thoughts begin to slow, and the ordinary mystery of consciousness, of who you are, of what you believe and why you believe it, of what shapes the quiet architecture of your inner life, settles around you like water finding its level. Someone, once, thought that architecture could be engineered, that the private room of a person's mind could be entered, rearranged and exited without leaving a visible trace. They spent 20 years and millions of dollars trying to prove they were right, and then they destroyed the evidence of what they found. Sleep well, sleepy koala army. And remember, whatever you dream tonight, whatever thoughts visit you in the quiet hours between waking and sleep, they are yours. They have always been yours. At least that is what they want you to believe. Good night. Afterword. What the record shows. For those of you who find it difficult to simply let this one go, and I understand completely if you do, let me leave you with a few documented facts. Not theories, not speculation. Things that are established on the record and verifiable through public sources. It is a fact that the United States government conducted non-consensual psychological and pharmacological experiments on its own citizens for a period of at least 2 decades. It is a fact that those experiments caused lasting harm to an unknown number of people, because the records were destroyed before the full subject list could be reconstructed. It is a fact that the destruction of those records was ordered by the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. It is a fact that the official investigation into MK Ultra was conducted using only the small fraction of documents that survived that destruction by accident. It is a fact that the United States government has, at various points since the 1970s, conducted classified behavioural research programs whose full contents remain unknown to the public. It is a fact that American intelligence agencies have used psychological profiling, behavioural analysis, and targeted information operations both domestically and abroad, and that the legal and ethical frameworks governing those operations have been inconsistently applied and rarely subjected to meaningful independent oversight. It is a fact that the questions MK Ultra was asking: how do you change what a person believes? How do you make someone do something they would not otherwise choose to do? How do you shape perception at scale? Are questions that have grown more answerable, not less, with the passage of time and the development of technology. None of these facts constitute proof that MK Ultra itself continued, but they establish something important. The impulse behind it did not disappear. The desire to understand and to use psychological influence as a tool of power is not a relic of the Cold War. It is an enduring feature of the landscape in which power operates, and enduring features of landscapes tend to find expression, regardless of whether the specific program that once gave them expression has been officially terminated. History is not a series of events that begin and end cleanly. It is a continuous flow of cause and effect, in which the things that are officially terminated have a habit of leaving shadows that outlast them. MK Ultra cast a long shadow. How long that shadow actually extends, whether it reaches all the way to the present, or whether it faded sometime in the 1970s when the documents were shredded and the curtain fell, is a question that the evidence, in its current state, cannot definitively answer. But the shadow is there. It has always been there. And it is worth knowing that it exists, worth carrying the awareness of it as you move through a world full of information and influence and systems that have strong interests in shaping what you think and feel and choose. That awareness is not paranoia. It is not the territory of people who wear foil hats and distrust their neighbours. It is the reasonable, historically informed recognition that institutional power has a long record of pursuing its interests in ways that are hidden from the people, most affected by those interests. And that knowing this, sitting with this, taking it seriously, is one of the most important things a thoughtful person can do in an era when the tools available for psychological influence have never been more powerful, more subtle or more difficult to detect. MKUltra happened. That is not in question. The only questions that remain are what we learned from it, what we chose not to learn from it, and whether the lesson that power took from its exposure was truly one of restraint, or simply one of concealment. Sleep well, think clearly, and never stop asking the questions that make the comfortable uncomfortable. Before we begin, if you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review means the world to us, and if you want, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening, and of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing really helps us keep bringing you these stories. Now let's get into it. They say power whispers, but in the California redwoods, beneath trees that have stood for centuries, power doesn't need to speak at all. It simply gathers and waits. Part 1. The recording. The camera was hidden in a hollowed-out book. Alex had carried it for 3 miles through the forest, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every snapped twig beneath his boots felt like a gunshot. Every shadow between the towering redwoods seemed to shift and watch. It was mid-July in the year 2000, and Alex Jones had just done something most journalists only fantasized about. He had infiltrated Bohemian Grove. The fence had been easier to climb than expected. No electric wire, no guards with dogs, just chain link and darkness and the smell of California pine heavy in the summer air. He'd studied satellite photos for weeks, memorized the layout, waited until the first night of the encampment when security would be focused inward, not out. The reconnaissance had taken months. Alex had spoken with former employees, kitchen staff who'd signed non-disclosure agreements, maintenance workers who'd seen things they couldn't legally discuss. Each conversation had been careful, coded. One former groundskeeper had drawn a map on a napkin in a diner outside Monterey, then burned it in the ashtray before leaving. Another had simply said, "First Saturday night, after dark, stay in the trees." Now he crouched behind a massive redwood trunk watching. The bark pressed against his back, rough and ancient. Somewhere in the distance an owl, a real one, called out into the night. The sound seemed like a warning. Through the trees he could see firelight, hear voices, low, rhythmic, chanting. The sound rolled through the grove like distant thunder, raising goosebumps along his arms despite the warm night. It wasn't the words that unsettled him. He couldn't make those out yet, but the tone, the unified cadence of dozens of voices speaking as one. He pressed record. The camera captured what most of the world would never see. Dozens of figures in dark robes gathering in a clearing. At the centre stood something that didn't belong in any California forest. A stone owl towering 40 feet high, its blank eyes reflecting the flames below. The owl's face was impassive, carved with an almost Egyptian quality. Ancient, knowing, indifferent to human concerns. The ceremony was called the Cremation of Care. Alex didn't know that yet. He only knew that some of the most powerful men in America were standing in the darkness, wearing hoods, chanting at a stone idol while something burned in an effigy at its base. The effigy was human-shaped, wrapped in fabric, suspended above the flames by chains. As it burned, the chanting grew louder. His voice echoed across the clearing, amplified, theatrical, speaking in archaic language about casting off the burden of conscience, about freedom from responsibility, about 2 weeks of pure indulgence without guilt. Alex's finger stayed on the record button, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. He filmed for 17 minutes before he heard footsteps behind him. Heavy boots on forest floor, multiple people, moving with purpose. Security had spotted him, or someone had reported movement in the restricted zone. When he finally escaped back over that fence, footage secured, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely drive. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. He didn't stop at the motel where he'd been staying. He drove straight through, 5 hours back to the Bay Area, checking his rearview mirror every 30 seconds. The video would be uploaded within days, and the question it raised was simple, haunting, and impossible to fully answer. Why do the world's most powerful men gather in total secrecy to perform rituals in the woods? Part 2, The Beginning. 128 years earlier, in 1872, 5 men sat in a San Francisco tavern and decided to start a club. They were writers, journalists, artists, men who valued culture over commerce, poetry over profit. They called themselves Bohemians, wanderers, freethinkers, people who rejected the rigid social structures of Gilded Age America. The founding members were modest in means but ambitious in spirit. Henry Edwards, a journalist for the San Francisco Examiner. James Bowman, a struggling painter whose landscapes never sold. Joseph Redding, a poet whose work appeared in small literary magazines nobody read. They met in cheap taverns, rented rooms above bakeries for meetings, staged plays in borrowed theatres. The Bohemian Club was born from good intentions. Their motto, borrowed from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, was elegant. Weaving spiders come not here. It meant business and politics were forbidden. Only art mattered, only creativity, only the meeting of minds unchained from the pursuit of wealth. For 27 years it stayed that way. The club met in the city. They performed plays, read poetry, debated philosophy. Membership was exclusive but modest. Journalists who couldn't afford lavish lifestyles, painters who worked in cramped studios, musicians who played for passion instead of pay. Annual dues were kept low deliberately, to ensure artists could afford to participate. Then, in 1899, everything changed. The club purchased 2,700 acres of ancient redwood forest north of San Francisco in Sonoma County. The money came from a wealthy patron, an industrialist, named William Crocker, whose father had built the Central Pacific Railroad. Crocker wasn't an artist, he was a banker, but he appreciated culture, or so he said, and he wanted to support the club's vision. They called it Bohemian Grove. The first summer encampment was held that same year. 2 weeks of camping, drinking, performing plays beneath the trees. Members slept in tents, cooked over campfires, staged elaborate theatrical productions on outdoor stages they built themselves. It was supposed to be an escape, a place where creative souls could breathe. But money always follows beauty, and power always follows money. Within 5 years, the membership had shifted. Bankers joined, claiming an appreciation for the arts. Railroad executives attended performances and asked to become members. Oil magnates from Southern California heard about the Grove and requested invitations. The artists noticed, of course. They complained in private letters, in journal entries that would be discovered decades later. One founding member wrote, "We built a sanctuary from wealth, and wealth has followed us here. They dress as we do, speak as we do, but they are not us. They are tourists in our world." But the club needed money. Maintaining 2,700 acres of pristine forest wasn't cheap, and the wealthy patrons were generous. They funded new cabins, improved facilities, hired staff to manage the property. All they asked in return was membership, access. The artists told themselves it would be fine, that the motto still mattered, that business and politics would still be banned. They were wrong. Part 3. When the poets left. By 1905, the membership roles had shifted completely. Where there had once been struggling writers, there were now railroad tycoons. Where there had been painters, there were now bankers, industrialists joined, oil magnates, men whose decisions shaped markets, cities, entire regions. The original artists didn't leave immediately. They stayed, watching their club transform around them. Some adapted, finding wealthy patrons among the new members. Others grew bitter, attending less frequently, until they stopped coming altogether. A few died, their obituaries noting their founding membership in the Bohemian Club, a detail that meant less with each passing year. The motto remained the same: "Weaving spiders come not here." But everyone knew it had become a lie. The business deals happened anyway, just quietly. A railroad executive and a mining company owner would take a walk through the forest discussing land rights. A banker and a politician would share drinks by the campfire talking about legislation. No formal contracts were signed at the Grove. That would violate the spirit of the motto. But understandings were reached, handshakes were exchanged, partnerships were formed. By the 1920s, the transformation was complete. Herbert Hoover attended regularly, years before becoming president. He was Secretary of Commerce at the time, and the Grove gave him access to the titans of American industry in an informal setting. Decisions that might take months of official meetings in Washington could be sketched out over a weekend in the Redwoods. Dwight Eisenhower was a regular guest in the 40s and 50s. A Supreme Allied commander during World War II, he'd become accustomed to making decisions of global consequence. The Grove offered something different, a place to network with the civilian leadership that controlled defence budgets, manufacturing capacity, political support. Richard Nixon came repeatedly throughout his career. He'd first attended in the late 40s, shortly after being elected to Congress. The Grove was where he made the connections that would carry him to the vice presidency, then the presidency, then ultimately to resignation in disgrace. But even after Watergate, even after his political career had ended, he maintained his membership. Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr., Henry Kissinger, military leaders, intelligence officials, CEOs of companies that controlled more wealth than most nations. The list reads like a shadow government, and perhaps that's exactly what it was. The Bohemian Grove had evolved. It was no longer a retreat for artists. It was a gathering place for the architects of American power. And what happened there? What was discussed? What was decided? What was agreed upon in hushed conversations between men who shaped policy and war and economy remained locked behind walls of absolute secrecy. Part 4. The Manhattan Project. September 1942. The world was at war. Nazi Germany had swept across Europe, occupying France, bombing London into rubble, pushing deep into Soviet territory. Imperial Japan controlled the Pacific from mainland China to the Philippines. America had been pulled into the conflict less than a year earlier, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, still scrambling to mobilize an economy that had spent the previous decade in depression. That September, during the Bohemian Grove's annual encampment, a meeting occurred that would change human history. Present were some of the most brilliant scientific minds in America. Ernest Lawrence, a physicist who had invented the cyclotron and would win the Nobel Prize. J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist from Berkeley who spoke 6 languages and quoted Hindu scripture. Military officials whose names remain partially classified to this day, Men who understood strategy and logistics and the brutal mathematics of total war. The meeting happened in a camp called Chowder and Marching Society. It wasn't a public gathering, no stage, no audience, no theatrical performance. Just a dozen men in a cabin talking late into the night. They drank scotch, they smoked cigarettes. They discussed the possibility of building a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. The physics was theoretical but promising. German scientists had discovered nuclear fission in 1938. Jewish physicists fleeing the Nazis had brought that knowledge to America, along with a terrifying certainty. If they could figure out how to weaponize atomic energy, so could Hitler. The question wasn't whether to build the bomb. The question was how quickly it could be done, and whether America could do it before Germany. No official minutes were recorded, no transcripts exist. But historians have confirmed the meeting happened. Lawrence's personal papers mention the Grove gathering. Oppenheimer's biographers reference conversations that took place there. Military records show that key personnel were granted leave to attend the encampment that year, despite wartime restrictions on travel. Shortly afterward, within weeks, the Manhattan Project was formally accelerated. Funding increased exponentially. Personnel expanded from dozens to thousands. Facilities were built in secret locations: Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, Los Alamos, New Mexico. The secret program to develop atomic weapons shifted into high gear. Conspiracy theorists point to this and ask a simple question. Did they plan the atomic bomb at Bohemian Grove? The answer is more complicated than yes or no. They didn't design the bomb there. The physics was developed in labs, the engineering in Los Alamos, the uranium enrichment in massive facilities that required industrial infrastructure. But the decision to move forward, the political will, the strategic coordination between military and scientific leadership, the allocation of resources on a scale never before attempted, may have crystallized in those private conversations beneath the redwoods. Think about what that means. The most consequential weapon in human history, the device that would kill hundreds of thousands at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the technology that would define global politics for the next 80 years. Its development may have been accelerated by conversations held at a private men's club, away from congressional oversight, away from public debate, away from any democratic process. No oversight, no press, no records, just power, talking to power, deciding the fate of the world over whiskey and campfire smoke. Part 5. The Owl. The stone owl stands at the edge of a small lake called Mirror Lake, 40 feet tall, carved from concrete and stone, its wings spread wide, its eyes empty and unblinking. The construction is crude by modern standards. The owl looks less like a majestic bird and more like an ancient idol, something that might be discovered in ruins of a forgotten civilization. At its base is a shrine, an altar where the Cremation of Care ceremony takes place every summer. The ritual happens on the first Saturday night of the encampment. Members are informed of the time through word of mouth. No printed schedules, no announcements. As sunset approaches, men begin gathering at their camps, changing into robes. Each camp has its own colour: red, black, green, brown. The robes are simple, hooded, monastic. By nightfall, hundreds of robed figures form a procession through the trees. They carry torches, real fire, not electric lights. The procession is silent except for the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. The path winds through the grove for nearly a mile before reaching Mirror Lake. The owl looms above them, lit from below by carefully positioned floodlights that make it appear even larger, more imposing. The lake reflects everything: the owl, the torches, the gathering crowd, creating the illusion of two ceremonies, one above and one below, mirror images in an ancient rite. When the procession is complete, the ceremony begins. It's elaborate, professionally produced. A sound system hidden in the trees broadcasts music, orchestral, dramatic, specifically composed for this ritual. There's narration delivered by a voice that booms across the water with theatrical gravitas. The narration tells a story. Care, the burden of conscience, arrives at the grove seeking to ruin the members' enjoyment. The owl, representing wisdom, representing the ancient knowledge that transcends human morality, rejects care, condemns it, orders it destroyed. Care is represented by a human-shaped effigy, suspended by chains above a pyre at the owl's base. As the narration reaches its climax, the effigy is lowered into the flames. It burns for several minutes while the robed figures watch in silence. The message is clear. For the next 2 weeks, these men are free from the burden of responsibility, free from guilt, free from the weight of their decisions. Care means worry, responsibility, conscience, guilt. The ceremony represents shedding those burdens. Officially, it's described as harmless theatre, a tradition dating back to the early 1920s, created by a member who was a professional theatre director. A way for powerful men to relax and forget the weight of their decisions. Nothing more than elaborate performance art, a bit of pageantry to mark the beginning of the encampment. But symbolism matters. When you tell the world's most influential leaders that they can, symbolically, ritually, burn away their sense of responsibility, what are you really doing? When CEOs who make decisions affecting thousands of employees watch care burn, what message do they receive? When politicians who control military budgets see conscience destroyed by fire, what permission are they being given? When generals who order troops into combat participate in a ritual that explicitly celebrates freedom from moral burden, what does that say about the wars they'll wage? Are you helping them relax? Or are you giving them permission? The owl is Minerva, they say, Roman goddess of wisdom. The ceremony is about wisdom transcending worry, about strategic thinking unencumbered by emotion. But Minerva was also the goddess of warfare, and wisdom without conscience is just calculation. Part 6. Nixon's tape. August 1971. President Richard Nixon was in the Oval Office speaking with his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman. The conversation was recorded, as all conversations in Nixon's White House were, captured by the secret taping system that would eventually destroy his presidency. They were discussing the Bohemian Grove. The context is important. Nixon and Haldeman were talking about campaign strategy for the upcoming election. They'd been reviewing potential donors, discussing who to court, who to invite to White House dinners. Someone, the tape doesn't make clear who, had suggested reaching out to Bohemian Grove members. Nixon's response was immediate and visceral. The Bohemian Grove, I won't go into it, but it's the most effing goddamn thing you could ever imagine. The profanity was unusual for Nixon on tape. He cursed occasionally, but this was emphatic, emotional, the kind of language people use when describing something that genuinely disturbed them. He refused to elaborate. The recording cuts to a different topic, something about fundraising in California, details that seemed trivial compared to what had just been said. Whatever Nixon meant, whatever he saw or experienced or understood about the Grove, he never explained publicly. The comment was discovered years later during the Watergate investigation, buried in hours of White House recordings that were being analysed for evidence of obstruction of justice. People still debate what he meant. Was he disgusted by something he witnessed? Nixon had attended the Grove multiple times throughout his political career. He'd participated in the Cremation of Care ceremony. He'd networked with the members, built the relationships that would carry him to the presidency. But his comment suggested something more than simple distaste for theatre. Was he impressed in a way that troubled him? The phrase, most goddamn thing you could imagine, could mean extraordinary, overwhelming beyond normal experience. Perhaps he'd seen the true extent of the power concentrated in those woods, and it had shaken something in him. Was he horrified? Nixon was many things, calculating, paranoid, ruthless when necessary, but he wasn't immune to moral consideration. The Watergate scandal showed his capacity for wrongdoing, but the tapes also showed a man who sometimes agonized over decisions, who understood the weight of presidential power. Perhaps something at the Grove had crossed a line he didn't want to discuss. Was he amused in a dark way? Nixon had a cynical streak. Maybe he found the whole thing absurd. Powerful men playing dress-up, performing elaborate rituals, taking themselves so seriously. But if it was just silly theatre, why refuse to explain it? The ambiguity is the point. If Bohemian Grove was just a social club, just a place where old men dressed up and performed silly rituals, why did the President of the United States refuse to describe it? What was he protecting? Or what was he afraid to reveal? Haldeman, for his part, never elaborated either. Years later, after serving time for his role in Watergate, he was occasionally asked about the Grove in interviews. He always deflected, changed the subject, or said simply, "It's a private club, members don't discuss it." But the tape remains. Nixon's voice, recorded without his knowledge, preserved for history. A sitting president in the privacy of the Oval Office, describing something he'd personally witnessed as the most goddamn thing you could imagine, and then refusing to explain what that meant. Part 7. The Rules. Bohemian Grove operates under rules so strict they resemble military classification protocols. The official rulebook is short, just a few pages, but every word is enforced absolutely. Violations lead to immediate expulsion. No appeals, no exceptions. Members who've belonged for decades have been banned for single infractions. No press allowed, ever. Not mainstream media, not independent journalists, not documentary filmmakers. No exceptions. Reporters who've attempted to enter have been detained by private security, sometimes turned over to local law enforcement on trespassing charges. The club's lawyers are aggressive about prosecution. No recording devices, cameras, phones, audio equipment, all banned. Members are expected to surrender electronics at entry, or leave them locked in cars. Some camps conduct electronic sweeps to ensure compliance. The prohibition is taken so seriously that even senior members have been expelled for photographing their own camp areas. No wives or female guests. The Grove is exclusively male. Women are not permitted on the grounds during the encampment, with the exception of a handful of staff members who serve meals and clean cabins. Even female family members of members, daughters, mothers, sisters, are prohibited. The only women allowed are those working in service positions. This rule in particular has generated criticism. Why exclude women entirely? The official explanation is tradition, a preservation of the club's original all-male culture. But critics point out that excluding half the population from a space where policy is discussed and power is consolidated effectively excludes women from certain networks of influence. No public statements. What happens at the Grove stays at the Grove. Members who violate this rule face permanent expulsion. The prohibition extends beyond just talking to press. Members are expected not to discuss Grove matters with anyone, including family members. There are stories of wives who never knew their husbands attended, who discovered the membership only after death when dealing with estate paperwork. There are accounts of children who grew up unaware their fathers disappeared for 2 weeks every July, told only that it was a business retreat or camping trip. Staff sign non-disclosure agreements that extend for decades. Even after leaving employment, they are legally bound not to discuss what they've seen or heard. The NDAs include substantial financial penalties for violations, amounts large enough to bankrupt most working-class people. Some former staff have reported receiving legal threats years after leaving, when the club suspected they might be considering talking to journalists. A former kitchen worker interviewed anonymously in the late 90s said, "I worked there for 3 summers. I saw things, heard things, but I signed papers saying I'd never discuss it, and those papers don't expire. Ever. They made that very clear." Conspiracy theorists argue that this level of secrecy exceeds anything necessary for a social club. If it's just theatre, just rich men playing dress-up in the woods, why the ironclad silence? Why the NDAs? Why the absolute prohibition on documentation? The official answer is privacy. Powerful people deserve a place to relax without scrutiny. Public figures, politicians, CEOs, generals, live under constant observation. Every word is analysed, every action is recorded, every decision is debated. The Grove offers freedom from that burden. a place to be human, to make mistakes, to speak without calculation. That answer would be more convincing if the Grove welcomed documentation that could prove its innocence. If rituals are harmless, why not allow filming? If conversations are purely social, why ban note-taking? If nothing illegal or unethical occurs, why threaten legal action against anyone who discusses what happens there? Privacy and secrecy are not the same thing. Privacy protects individuals from unwanted intrusion. Secrecy protects actions from accountability. The Grove's rules are designed for secrecy. Part 8. The Camps. Bohemian Grove is divided into more than 100 smaller camps, each with its own name, character and membership. Mandalay, Hillbillies, Caveman, Stowaway, Isle of Aves, Silverado Squatters, Lost Angels, Owl's Nest. The names range from whimsical to pretentious, but the hierarchy is real. Some camps are more prestigious than others, some are older, more connected to power. Membership in certain camps is a signal of status within the Grove's internal social structure. Mandalay is considered the most elite. Its members have included multiple presidents, defense secretaries, Supreme Court justices. The camp is located in a prime spot within the Grove, close to the lake, surrounded by old-growth redwoods. The cabins are larger, better appointed. When members give lakeside talks, a daily tradition at the Grove, Mandalay members are given prime-speaking slots. Hillbillies is another high-status camp with a membership that leans toward business leaders, CEOs of major corporations, private equity executives, venture capitalists. The camp throws elaborate parties, brings in expensive whiskey, hires musicians to perform. Caveman, despite its primitive name, is equally prestigious. Military leaders, intelligence officials, defense contractors. The camp has a reputation for serious conversations about national security, geopolitics, strategic planning. Lower status camps exist on the periphery of the Grove, housed in smaller cabins, with memberships that include newly inducted members, younger executives still building their careers, academics and artists who provide intellectual credibility but less practical power. Members spend their 2 weeks rotating between camps, attending lakeside talks, watching theatrical performances, drinking heavily, and most importantly, talking. The daily schedule at the Grove is structured but flexible. Mornings begin with breakfast at individual camps. Then members gather at the lakeside for talks, informal presentations on various topics, given by members or invited guests. Topics range from politics to technology to philosophy. Past speakers have included sitting presidents, Nobel Prize winners, top scientists. Afternoons are for socializing. Members wander between camps, join impromptu discussions, take walks through the forest. This is when the real networking happens. CEOs sit beside generals on fallen logs, discussing defense contracts. Politicians share drinks with intelligence officials, talking about foreign policy. Corporate executives have breakfast with Supreme Court justices, mentioning cases that might affect their businesses. Evenings bring theatrical performances on the Grove's outdoor stages. Productions are elaborate, professionally designed, performed by members who've rehearsed for months. Some are comedies, some are dramas, some are musical reviews. The quality varies, but the attendance is mandatory, a way to ensure all members gather together at least once daily. Late nights are for drinking and deeper conversations. This is when guards are lowered, when the formal structure dissolves, when friendships are cemented and alliances are formed. There are no aides present, no assistants, no one taking notes, no transcripts, no oversight, just conversation. And here's where conspiracy theories find their footing. In 1953, shortly after a Bohemian Grove encampment, the CIA launched Operation Ajax, overthrowing the democratically elected government of Iran and installing the Shah. Multiple attendees of that summer's Grove gathering were directly involved in planning the coup. Allen Dulles, CIA director, Kermit Roosevelt, the CIA officer who ran the operation on the ground, executives from oil companies that would benefit enormously from Iranian oil concessions. Coincidence? The official story is that Operation Ajax was planned in CIA headquarters, approved through proper channels, executed by trained operatives, and that's true. But the will to proceed, the decision that regime change was acceptable, that democracy could be sacrificed for strategic interests, may have been reinforced by conversations at the Grove. In 1967, energy policy discussions at the Grove preceded major shifts in American oil strategy. Executives from companies that profited enormously from those shifts were present. Within months, federal regulations changed, opening new areas for drilling, reducing environmental restrictions, providing tax benefits for oil production. Coincidence? Policy doesn't change in a vacuum. Someone has to advocate for it, someone has to convince legislators, someone has to coordinate between industry and government. The Grove provided a space for those conversations to happen informally, away from congressional hearings, away from public scrutiny. In 1989, defence contractors who attended the Grove saw their contracts renewed and expanded under the next administration. Many of those contractors had been camping alongside future cabinet members, sharing drinks, discussing the importance of military readiness, arguing for increased defence spending. Coincidence? In 2001, weeks after that Summers Grove encampment, the September 11th attacks occurred. The response, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the expansion of surveillance powers, the increase in defence and intelligence budgets, benefited many Grove members. Was the specific attack foreseeable? No. But the broader policy framework that enabled the response, the prioritisation of security over liberty, the willingness to wage preemptive war, had been discussed at the Grove for years. Coincidence? No one can prove coordination. But the proximity, the casual, unrecorded mingling of people who later make decisions that align perfectly, raises questions that are impossible to dismiss entirely. Part 9. The Infiltrators. Alex Jones wasn't the first person to try to expose Bohemian Grove. He was just the first to bring back video. Before him, journalists had attempted to breach the perimeter. Most were caught, detained, and escorted off the property with threats of legal action. A few managed to observe from a distance but saw nothing conclusive. The Grove security was professional, experienced, thorough. In 1989, a team of activists from San Francisco attempted a coordinated infiltration. They planned for months, studying the layout, timing their approach for maximum confusion during the opening ceremony. 3 people made it over the fence. All 3 were caught within 30 minutes, detained in a security building, then handed over to local law enforcement on trespassing charges. They spent the night in jail. The charges were eventually dropped, but the message was clear. The Grove was protected. In the mid-90s, a freelance journalist named Rick posed as a service worker. He managed to get hired on kitchen staff, passed the background check, signed the NDA. He worked for 4 days before someone recognised him from a previous article he'd written about elite clubs. He was escorted off property immediately, threatened with a lawsuit for fraud and breach of contract. The lawsuit never materialised. The club likely didn't want the publicity, but Rick's notes and recordings were confiscated. In 2000, Alex Jones succeeded because he was brazen. He didn't sneak in like a spy. He walked in like he belonged. He studied how members moved, how they dressed, what they carried. On the night of the Cremation of Care ceremony, he simply walked through an entrance gate during a shift change, moving with purpose, looking like he had every right to be there. Security at the Grove follows a simple principle. People who belong act like they belong. They don't hesitate, don't look around nervously, don't question their right to access. Jones understood this. He wore dark clothing that could pass for staff uniform in dim light. He carried the hollowed-out book casually, like it was a notebook or prop for the ceremony. He moved toward the gathering crowd with confidence. Once in the crowd, he was invisible. Hundreds of robed figures, all anonymous, all focused on the ceremony. He positioned himself at the edge, behind a massive redwood trunk, and filmed for 17 minutes. The footage he captured showed exactly what Grove officials had always described: a theatrical ritual, performed in robes, involving a stone owl and a symbolic burning. No human sacrifice, no occult summoning, no illegal activity, just theatre. But the image was undeniably strange. Powerful men in robes, chanting in unison, watching an effigy burn while a voice boomed about destroying care and conscience. The footage went viral when Jones released it, spawning countless conspiracy theories, documentaries, YouTube videos, and the fact that it was kept so secret, despite being just theatre, made people wonder what else might be hidden. British journalist John Ronson also infiltrated the Grove around the same time. He was researching a book about extremists and conspiracy theorists, and he wanted to see the Grove for himself. He attended as a guest of a member, not a full infiltration, but still a rare glimpse inside. His account, published in Them, Adventures with Extremists, was more measured than Jones's. He confirmed the rituals are real, the secrecy is absolute, and the membership includes some of the most powerful people in the world. But he also noted the strange disconnect between the ceremony's dramatic presentation and the casual atmosphere afterward. Members treated it like any other theatre performance, applauding at the end, then heading back to their camps for drinks. Ronson wrote, "The Cremation of Care is the most bizarre piece of theatre I've ever witnessed. But what struck me wasn't the ritual itself. It was how normal the participants found it. They'd been doing this for decades. It was tradition. And tradition, no matter how strange, becomes invisible to those who practice it." What neither infiltration could reveal was the content of private conversations. What was said in the cabins? What was discussed during late-night walks through the forest? What agreements, explicit or implicit, were reached over drinks and campfires? That remains unknown. And perhaps that's the point. The Grove doesn't hide its rituals because the rituals are sinister. It hides its conversations because the conversations are powerful. The Cremation of Care is theatre. Strange theatre, symbolic theatre, theatre that reinforces a particular worldview, but theatre nonetheless. The real secret is what happens after the ceremony ends. Part 10. The Conspiracy. Let's be clear about what Bohemian Grove is not. It is not a site of human sacrifice. No credible evidence supports this. The rituals involve effigies, not people. Claims of ritual murder based on misinterpretation, deliberate misrepresentation, or outright fabrication. It is not a centre of occult magic. The owl symbolises Minerva, Roman goddess of wisdom. The ceremony is theatrical, not supernatural. There are no spells being cast, no demons being summoned, no supernatural forces being invoked. The participants are powerful, but they're not wizards. It is not illegal. Everything that happens at the Grove, so far as we know, is protected by privacy rights and freedom of association. Wealthy people are allowed to form private clubs. They're allowed to perform strange rituals. They're allowed to network with each other. None of that violates any law. But here's what it might be. A coordination space. A place where people who control industries, governments, and militaries can speak freely, without record, without oversight, and without the constraints of public accountability. Think about how policy normally works in a democracy. Proposed legislation is debated publicly. Congressional hearings are held. Interest groups lobby openly. The press covers developments. Citizens can track how their representatives vote, can pressure them, can vote them out if they disagree with their decisions. But what happens when the people making policy, or influencing those who make policy, can meet privately to coordinate positions before any public process begins? What happens when a CEO and a senator can agree on environmental regulations before any bill is introduced, ensuring the final legislation will benefit the CEO's company? What happens when a general and a defense contractor can discuss weapon systems before any Pentagon procurement process begins, ensuring the contractor's bid will be favoured? What happens when industry executives can brief politicians on their preferred policies, provide talking points, coordinate strategies, all before any congressional debate occurs? That's not illegal. But it subverts the democratic process. It creates a shadow channel where decisions are shaped before the public even knows there's a decision to be made. The Grove provides that channel, a bonding mechanism. Shared rituals create loyalty. When you've stood beside someone in a robe, chanting at an owl statue, you've shared something strange and intimate. That creates trust. That creates obligation. Psychological research on group bonding is clear. Shared experiences, especially unusual or emotionally significant experiences, create strong social ties. Military units use shared hardship to build cohesion. Fraternities use initiation rituals to create loyalty. Religious communities use ceremonies to reinforce belonging. The Bohemian Grove's rituals serve the same function. When a CEO and a politician participate in the Cremation of Care together, they're not just watching theatre. They're engaging in a shared ritual that marks them as part of the same tribe. They're members of the same exclusive club. They've participated in the same strange ceremony. That creates a bond that transcends professional relationships. And bonds create obligations. If you're a senator and you need to make a decision that will affect a company, and the CEO of that company is a fellow Grove member who stood beside you at the Cremation of Care, that relationship affects your thinking. Not overtly, not through explicit corruption, but through the subtle influence of social connection, a pressure release valve. The Cremation of Care isn't just symbolic fun, it's a psychological tool. It tells participants they can temporarily shed moral weight, and if you're making decisions that affect millions of lives, that kind of psychological permission might be useful. Consider what these men do in their normal lives. CEOs make decisions that result in layoffs, that prioritise shareholders over workers, that externalise environmental costs onto communities. Politicians make decisions that send soldiers to war, that cut social programmes to reduce deficits, that protect certain industries while others struggle. Generals make decisions that result in deaths, enemy deaths, civilian deaths, sometimes the deaths of their own troops. Those decisions have moral weight. Human psychology requires us to either justify those decisions or carry guilt about them. The Cremation of Care offers a third option: ritualise permission to stop caring, even temporarily, even symbolically. It's not that Grove members are cartoonishly evil, cackling as they burn effigies and plot world domination. It's that they've created a space where moral consideration can be set aside, where strategic thinking can proceed without the burden of conscience, where decisions can be made purely on the basis of power and benefit. None of this is provable, but correlation is compelling. When the same people who attend Bohemian Grove later shape policy, wage wars, shift economies, and redefine global power structures, and when those decisions consistently benefit the same small circle of attendees, questions are inevitable. The conspiracy isn't that they're worshipping Satan or performing dark magic. The conspiracy is that they've created a space where power can coordinate without accountability, where relationships can be built that transcend democratic oversight, where decisions can be shaped before the public even knows there's a decision to be made. That's subtle, that's sophisticated, that's far more disturbing than any ritual. Part 11. The Present. Bohemian Grove still meets every summer. 2 weeks in July. Same location, same rituals, same secrecy. The encampment now occurs in the age of social media, satellite imagery, and ubiquitous surveillance technology. Yet somehow it remains largely hidden. The Grove has adapted its security to modern threats. Cell phone jammers are rumoured to be in use during sensitive gatherings. Drone detection systems protect against aerial photography. Digital surveillance of employees and members has intensified. Membership remains exclusive. Waiting lists stretch for years. Entry requires wealth, influence, or both. The initiation fee alone is tens of thousands of dollars, with annual dues to match. For most Americans, that cost is prohibitive. For the members, it's trivial. The demographics have shifted slightly over recent decades. While still overwhelmingly white and exclusively male, the Grove has admitted more tech CEOs, more international business leaders, more financiers from the globalized economy. The old guard, industrialists and politicians, share the camps with newer power brokers, venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, tech entrepreneurs. But the core purpose remains unchanged. Modern technology has made secrecy harder. Satellite imagery shows the layout. Anyone with Google Earth can see the camps, the stages, even the owl statue. Leaked membership lists circulate online, though the Grove denies their accuracy. Former staff occasionally break their NDAs and share fragments of stories, usually anonymously, usually with little concrete detail. But the core remains locked. No one outside the Grove knows what is said there. No one knows what deals are discussed. No one knows what coordination happens between the people who control the levers of power. In 2008, during the encampment, the financial crisis was already building. Members that summer included executives from banks that would soon fail, regulators who would be tasked with managing the collapse, politicians who would vote on bailout packages. What was discussed? What preparations were made? What understandings were reached about how the crisis would be managed? We don't know. In 2016, during the encampment, the presidential campaign was reaching its climax. Members included political operatives, major donors, media executives who would cover the race. What was discussed? What strategies were coordinated? What narratives were agreed upon? We don't know. In 2020, the encampment was cancelled due to the pandemic. For the first time in over a century, the Grove didn't meet. But in 2021, it resumed. Members included pharmaceutical executives, public health officials, politicians dealing with pandemic response. What was discussed about vaccine policy, about mandates, about the balance between public health and economic concerns? We don't know. And that's the real conspiracy. Not devil worship, not occult magic, not human sacrifice. Just power, gathering in private, away from scrutiny, talking without record. Epilogue: The Question. Here's what we know for certain. Bohemian Grove exists. This isn't speculation or conspiracy theory. It's a registered private club with a physical address, property deeds, tax records. The world's most powerful men meet there every summer. Membership lists, partial, sometimes outdated but largely accurate, have been leaked over the years. They confirm the presence of presidents, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, generals, intelligence directors, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. They perform rituals involving a stone owl and symbolic burning. Alex Jones's footage confirmed this. John Ronson's account confirmed this. Even the Grove's official materials acknowledge the Cremation of Care ceremony. They enforce absolute secrecy. The rules are documented, the NDAs are real. The security is professional and serious. They have done this for over a century. Bohemian Grove's annual encampments began in 1899 and have continued with only rare interruptions ever since. Major historical events, the Manhattan Project, political coups, economic shifts, wars, have followed closely after Grove gatherings, involving people who attended those gatherings. The correlations are documented in historical records, biographies, declassified documents. Here's what we don't know, what they talk about. No recordings exist, no transcripts, no leaked documents describing specific conversations. What they decide. Do explicit agreements get made? Or is it all just informal networking? We don't know. What they coordinate. Are strategies developed at the Grove later implemented in policy? Or are the connections purely social? We don't know. Whether any of it is illegal. Nothing we know about the Grove involves criminal activity. But legality and ethics aren't the same thing. Whether any of it should concern us. Is this just how power works in any society? Or is it a subversion of democratic principles? Reasonable people disagree. So the question isn't really, what happens at Bohemian Grove? The question is, why does the world's leadership need a place where no records exist? Think about that for a moment. These are people who run countries, corporations, militaries. Their decisions affect billions of people. Their policies shape economies, determine which nations prosper and which struggle, influence whether wars are fought or peace is maintained. Shouldn't those decisions be made transparently? Shouldn't the conversations that lead to those decisions be documented? Shouldn't the public have some window into how power is exercised on their behalf? The Grove's defenders argue that powerful people deserve privacy. that they need a space to speak freely without every word being analysed, that informal relationships and frank conversations are necessary for effective leadership. And there's truth in that, but there's also danger in it, because power without accountability tends toward abuse. Not always, not necessarily, but the tendency is there. Human psychology is clear on this. People in positions of power, insulated from consequences, gradually come to see their own interests and the public interest as identical. The Grove provides that insulation. It creates a space where the powerful can meet without oversight, can form relationships without transparency, can coordinate without accountability. Is it harmless networking? Is it strategic coordination? Or is it a reminder that real power operates best in the shadows, where questions can't be asked, where deals can't be documented, and where the people making decisions that shape our world never have to explain themselves? You decide, because the Grove isn't going anywhere, and neither are the secrets it keeps. Every July they gather, beneath the redwoods, around the owl, away from the world, and we're left outside watching shadows, asking questions, piecing together fragments of truth. Maybe that's exactly how they want it.